Hey everybody, and welcome to this week's Psych Soc lecture. Today we're going to be talking about sensation, perception, and attention. We'll just touch a little bit upon each of those. I don't think we're going to spend too much time on today's lecture. My name is Chris, and I work for Socratic Med. So this is just a quick introduction of what we do. So Socratic Med is a grassroots nonprofit to provide sensible solutions to students with disparate medical school opportunities. So I put some of our contact information below. We were just previously working on a 15-week course for MCAT prep, and we're now working on our 15-week supplement, which is just going to supplement the information gaps that were from that last course. So if you're watching these videos and you haven't checked out the original one, please give them a look. They're on YouTube. You can find them on our website. Definitely copy these links. We have office hours as well. We do personalized office hours with our tutors. You can click that link tree at the bottom. And that will link you to a bunch of these links and a couple of others that'll be pretty useful too if you're interested. And on more of a personal note, my name is Chris. I graduated from Stony Brook University in May of 2019. I finished with a pre-med track and a BS in applied math and statistics. I took the MCAT in April of 2021 and I scored a 520, which was the 97th percentile. And I got a perfect score on the Psych Soc section, so that's pretty much my specialty. I do psychology, sociology, and also biology. So those would be my areas of specialty if anybody were to come to my office hours. Okay, so the first topic we're going to talk a little bit about is sensation. Obviously, everybody's familiar with the 5 senses that we have. It's a little bit more complicated, obviously, on the MCAT. So we're just going to go over first the types of sensory receptors that you'll see on the MCAT. So the first class of receptors that I want to talk about are mechanoreceptors. These detect mechanical disturbances from stimuli. So these are how you feel pressure. This is how we feel. This is how we hear. This is how we regulate some of our GI workings. So a couple of the examples that I used were the auditory hair cells are the mechanoreceptors that help convert vibrations of sound waves into electrical impulses. So again, those hair cells are being physically disturbed by that sound wave, and it's creating that electrical impulse. So that's why we would classify an auditory hair cell as a mechanoreceptor. And stretch receptors are those receptors inside the GI tract. They detect distension. When the stomach or the intestines start to stretch, it's going to detect that sort of stretch in the membrane, and it's going to reduce appetite. So stretch receptors are pretty versatile and they're pretty common throughout your body. You can't live without them. So same chemoreceptors are the second type. They detect chemical traces in the environment. And the environment could be external or internal. So olfactory receptors, for example, are the sort of receptors that you use in your nose, and they detect airborne chemicals and they enable your sense of smell. So when you're smelling, really all you're doing is detecting the chemicals in the air. Your olfactory receptors are just picking up traces of chemicals, and they just try to identify what that smell is. So that would be an example of a chemoreceptor. We also have chemoreceptors inside our blood. So in the carotid and aortic arteries, they help us regulate specific pressures of gases. So we have like pH, pressure of CO2, and oxygen levels in the blood. So for example, when your CO2 levels rise, when the pressure of CO2 in your blood rises, chemoreceptors will start to fire, and that will induce a bunch of different changes. You'll start hyperventilating, for example, to get rid of the carbon dioxide and bring more oxygen into your body. So those are pretty diverse as well. We also have nociceptors, which are pain receptors. They respond to pain. So they're the simplest receptors. They usually just fire in response to chemical signals that indicate tissue damage. So it's usually like a nerve ending. They can be considered, like in their simplest form, chemical signals, but they're specialized chemical signals that transmit pain to the brain. And you can look over here to the left. There's a little bit of a diagram, and it pretty much shows, I guess, just all of the different receptors integrated actually into the skin. So we have root hair plexus, hair deformation, free nerve endings. Those are the nociceptors for pain. Messner's corpuscle, that's touch, so that's a mechanoreceptor. The corpuscle is another one that identifies vibration, so we have another mechanoreceptor. And you could take a look at all of these on your free time as well if you like to conceptualize things on a diagram. So a few more of the types of receptors. We have thermoreceptors, which fire due to changes in temperature. So peripheral thermoreceptors are categorized 3 ways. Peripheral meaning nervous system. We're talking about the nervous system, remember? So we have cold sensitive, warm sensitive, and thermal nociceptors. So obviously cold and warm sensitive are going to detect those specific temperatures, and then thermal nociceptors are those that detect pain from temperature. So at a certain point, when the temperature gets too hot, the thermal nociceptor will fire and it'll transmit a heat pain signal to the brain. We also have electromagnetic receptors. Those are stimulated by electromagnetic waves, or EM waves. And humans only contain two types of EM receptors, rods and cones, which, as you should know from other lectures, are located in the retina of the human eye. And I just put a little diagram to the right if you need a little bit of a refresher. Those are also known as photoreceptors. The only types of electromagnetic receptors that humans have are photoreceptors, and they're just rods and cones. So other animals may use specialized EM receptors for other purposes, like using magnetoreceptors to navigate. You can use the Earth's natural magnetic field. I know some birds use that to navigate during migration. Bees also have EM receptors for infrared, so they could see on a little bit more on a wider spectrum than humans can as well. So different animals have different EM receptors that they use for different reasons. And then really quickly, there are also pheromone receptors. They're not really well studied in humans, so they're not too high yield on the MCAT. But it's good to know that they do what they do. They regulate behavior of, and they allow for communication between smaller insects like bees and ants. So it's for, they'll use them in social settings or in really complex societies that bees, like complex insect societies like bees and ants. So they could use pheromones maybe to lead them to a food source, for reproduction, so for a number of social functions like that. Okay, so a little bit about sensory encoding. In order to identify and encode relevant information, 4 properties of the stimulus must be communicated to the central nervous system. So the first property of the stimulus that the central nervous system needs in order to understand and identify what the stimulus is the modality. So the modality is also known as the type. So the modality of the stimulus is determined based on which type of receptor is firing. So it could be a thermoreceptor, it could be an electromagnetic receptor. So based on based on which type of receptor is firing, that gives the central nervous system some information as to what kind of stimulus we are approaching. The location of the stimulus also is communicated by the receptive field of the receptor sending the signal. I don't want to make that sound too complicated. It's basically just the location of, we have a widespread nervous system, so the location of the stimulus is communicated to the central nervous system. The multiple neurons that are in that location will fire in the similar location, and that's going to communicate to the central nervous system where the actual signal is coming from. 3, the intensity of the stimulus is determined by the frequency of action potentials fired. So the more action potentials fired in a specific amount of time, the more intense the signal is going to be. And I just wanted to mention what range fractionation is. And that is the use of multiple groups of receptors with limited range to detect a wider range overall. So we could talk about cone cells in the eye, in the human eye, for example. We have a bunch of different kinds of cone cells in the eye, and each of them can detect a small portion of the spectrum of visible light. So if we have longer wavelengths like red colors, there are going to be a small certain amount of cone cells that'll pick those up. And if you have shorter wavelengths like blue or purple, there are going to be different cone cells in the eye that will pick those up. So altogether, each group of cone cells allows us to see the entire visible spectrum of light. So that is called range fractionation, when we have small groups with limited, and we combine them for a wider range overall. So 4 is the duration of the stimulus, and that is going to depend, the response to the stimulus is going to depend on the kind of receptor being activated. So the duration of that response. And there are 2 types when we're talking about duration. There are 2 types of receptors. The first one is called a tonic receptor, and that's going to fire continuously as long as the stimulus remains present. So these receptors are subject to adaptation. So adaptation, this should also be review. Adaptation is when you are constantly presented with a stimulus, the response to that stimulus is going to decrease, even though the intensity of the stimulus is remaining the same. So it usually happens, for example, when you walk into, say you walk into a bakery and you smell really good cookies. It's going to smell really strong when you first walk in, but if you stay in that bakery for a couple of minutes, in 5 minutes, you're not really going to smell the cookies anymore. The smell didn't go away, but it's just your interpretation of the smell it's decreased because of that adaptation. And then the other type of receptors that we'd be talking about are phasic receptors, and those fire only when the stimulus begins. So those really usually indicate like a change in stimulus, or they help like with changes in the environment. They only fire when the stimulus begins, so they're not subject to adaptation. Those are only the tonic receptors. Okay, and then a really quick review of proprioception. Proprioception, in broad terms, is the sense of awareness of oneself. So it's spatially, how you control your limbs, where you can see yourself in space. And it's also referred to as the kinesthetic sense. So proprioceptors help aid spatial awareness. There are any receptors that help aid spatial awareness. They're located in the inner ear. They can also help aid control of muscles and joints. So those are located in the muscles and joint supporting ligaments. So muscle spindles, for example, will help detect muscle stretch. And we see muscle spindles whenever we study that joint reflex, the reflex arcs. And we have joint capsule receptors as well, which detect pressure, tension, and movement in your joints. So all of these help us understand how we're using our limbs and understand where our limbs are. So it'll give us information as to how we're standing. Maybe, different pressure or tension on certain joints, certain parts of our body will give us information. So like if we look to the right over here, this diagram, I thought it was really cool because it gives a really good full picture of how proprioception can work in real time. So you have your receptors that are firing, but it's also sort of like a holistic integration of a bunch of different systems all at once, which usually is what any nervous response really is. So in this picture, you can see the brain receives and interprets information from multiple inputs. The vestibular organs in the inner ear send information about rotation, acceleration, and position. So she's going to be using a combination of those two to understand and recognize the actual bodily position that she is in on her hands. Eyes are sending visual information, so she can see that she's maybe a foot and a half off the ground. And the stretch receptors that we were just talking about in her skin, muscles, and joints are sending information about the position of body parts. There's probably going to be a lot more stress on the muscles and joints in her forearms than there are in her calves right now. So if she were not using visual cues to let her know that she were facing the ground right now, those sort of stretch receptors in her muscles would also be evidence to her conscious mind that she is in a different position and standing upright, if that makes sense. Okay, perfect time for a review question. So which of the following is not a chemoreceptor? So take a minute, take no more than a minute, think about it. Pause the video because I will reveal the answer and go over it in about 5 seconds. Okay, which of the following is not a chemoreceptor? So we have A, nociceptor, B, muscle spindle, G, gustatory receptor, or D, olfactory receptor. So the correct answer is B, muscle spindle. And that's just the muscle spindle, as we were talking about right over here, is part of proprioception. So they help detect muscle stretch. So if they're stretching, they're going to be mechanoreceptors, remember. Nociceptors are our pain receptors. And I mentioned before in the video that they can be considered like a simple form of chemoreceptors because what they do is detect chemicals that indicate tissue damage. So nociceptors could be considered chemoreceptors. Gustatory receptors are those that you use when you are tasting. Gustatory receptors are on your tongue. So they also use chemicals. They identify chemicals in your mouth, and olfactory receptors identify chemicals that are airborne that make it into your nose. So the only one out of all 4 of these choices that does not use a chemical to create an electrical impulse is a muscle spindle because it's a mechanoreceptor. Okay, a little bit about perception now. So feature detection and parallel processing. When processing visual information, neurons in the occipital lobe of the cortex will fire with specificity to certain features. So this is sort of what feature detection theory is. There are just different parts of the brain that are going to only fire when we are looking at certain things. So maybe a smaller part of the cortex is going to fire when we're looking at lines or edges in a specific orientation, or angles in a specific orientation even. So the information is then passed to further parts of the brain for processing after they are picked up by these parts of the cortex. And this is basically what feature detection theory is. So the human brain can't construct representations of it can construct representations of visual stimuli thanks to parallel processing. So parallel processing and feature detection theory, you'll usually hear hand in hand. And it's basically it just says that different parts of the cortex process different aspects of the visual field simultaneously rather than serially. So we know from feature detection theory that different parts of our brain can process different aspects of a certain visual field. So if you're looking at anything, say you're looking at a tree, one part of your brain can process the color of it. Another part is going to process the shape of it. Another is probably going to process the finer detail of it, maybe the texture of the actual tree. And this all happens at once because of parallel processing. So that allows us to sort of integrate and perceive that image in our mind pretty quickly. Okay, so top-down and bottom-up processing. There are two basic types of processing that we all use on a daily basis. So bottom-up processing involves starting your perception with basic sensation. So if you look to the right, that bottom-up processing, taking sensory information and then assembling and integrating it. So basically you're asking, what am I seeing? This type of processing is used more when the individual is unfamiliar with the stimulus and must rely on new information to construct a mental representation. So bottom processing, we're relying a lot on sensation. We're not relying on experience. It's basically most of the information we're getting is from what is in front of us, how we are perceiving that sensation and that stimulus input. That's really what bottom-up processing it is. It's very basic, as opposed to top-down processing, which allows the individual to draw from past experiences to create a representation of a familiar stimulus or situation. So we'll use models that we understand, ideas and algorithms, any kind of expectation, anything from our past that we can use to helpfully interpret the sensory information that we're bringing in. So instead of what am I seeing, you might recognize it. Is that something I've seen before? If you now recognize that as a tree because you've been studying trees for the last 20 years, you are going to perceive it a lot differently than someone who doesn't even know what a tree is, if that person were to exist. You would know what it eats, how long it lives, what climate it likes. So you would just have a very different mental representation of it, thank you to the advanced top-down processing that you have because of your experience with it. But all people use top-down and bottom-up processing, and usually it even occurs simultaneously. Okay, so keeping on perception, we're going to talk about depth perception for a little bit. So binocular depth cues are those that allow us to take advantage of having two eyes. So our depth perception allows us to take 2D images captured by the retina and represent them in 3 dimensions in our mind. Because we do live in a 3-dimensional world, but our eyes take 2-dimensional pictures. So we're technically seeing in 2 dimensions. We just have a lot of stuff going up in our brains that allows us to create this 3D representation in our mind. So most importantly, having 2 eyes allows for binocular cues. And this is what I was talking about before, how we can take advantage of having 2 eyes. So retinal disparity allows the brain to compare images coming from both eyes to provide information about its distance from the viewer. As objects get further, the disparity decreases, and we must rely on monocular cues. So it's only for objects that are pretty close, because the farther you go, the harder it is, since your eyes are only so far apart. The farther you go, the harder it is for either eye to tell that there's a difference, to tell that there actually is a disparity between the two. And if you look at the bottom, you can see a picture of someone holding up their thumb, and it says seen by left eye and seen by right eye. So if you actually take your thumb and you choose something in the distance and you put it up, and you close one eye and you close the other, you can see that your thumb seems like it moves into different positions. But we don't really see that consciously when we have both eyes open, because that's called retinal disparity, and our brain does a very good job of taking care of that and turning it into an image that makes sense to us. And then convergence is the other binocular cue, and the brain measures how greatly the eyes are turned inward to estimate the distance from the face. So it's basically just the actual physical angle of your eyes. So if your eyes are strained and turned inward more, like you're becoming cross-eyed, your brain is going to register that as you looking at something that is extremely close to your face. And the closer that your eyes get to a straight out 90-degree angle, that's a binocular clue that will let your brain know that it is farther out in the vision, in the field of vision. But when things are too far to see, or for some reason you can't use both eyes to see, we also can rely on monocular depth cues. So they depend on information that may only be available to one eye. And just because you have both eyes available does not mean you don't use monocular depth cues. It just means that these cues only depend on information that is available if you were to only use one lens. So there are some of the examples to the left, and I'll go over these to the right. You can also look these up online as well. Some of these are pretty visual, so if you're confused about one, please go on Google, look it up. There are a bunch of really helpful graphics that'll be able to help you out with that. So relative size, we do have over to the left, and that is relative size will change the perceived distance of an object. So larger objects are going to seem closer in the field of vision. So if you look to the left, we see that relative size over here. This cylinder to the left is bigger than the cylinder to the right. So it makes it appear as if this cylinder is closer to us than this one. So that's relative size. Interposition, objects that block other objects are perceived as closer to us. That is also known as occlusion, as you can see over here. A lot of these may just seem like common sense because we're just so used to using them unconsciously. Relative clarity, relative clarity, hazier objects may be seen as more distant than more clearly defined objects. So that does not look like it's on here, but that one is pretty self-explanatory. If you have two objects that are next to each other, the hazier object is just interpreted as more distant when compared to more clearly defined objects. Texture gradient, a change from a coarse, distinct texture, that should be COARSE, coarse distinct texture to a fine indistinct texture in an image may indicate increasing distance. So you can look over here at this texture gradient. If we have smoother shapes in the front and more indistinct shapes in the back, this texture gradient will make it seem as if we are moving farther away. So relative height, objects that are higher in the visual field are perceived as farther away. Do we have any over here? We don't. But imagine something like you're painting a picture and you're putting a house on a hill. If you put the house on the hill, it's going to be higher because we're trying to, put it on a hill in the background and we're trying to indicate distance. So relative height, objects that are higher in the visual field are perceived as farther away. Relative motion, objects that are near to us appear to move faster than those farther away from us. If you're on a train, you could see a train close, or you're at a train station, you could see a train passing by. It'll seem really quick. But if you look up at an airplane, it seems like it's going much slower because it's farther away. But in reality, it is absolutely not going slower, of course. Linear perspective, parallel lines seem to converge as distance increases. So we do have that one over here. Linear perspective, we interpret this as a road that is going farther away. It's increasing its distance from the viewer. So we would accept these as parallel lines, even though our field of view, we see that they're converging. So that's linear perspective. That gives us the impression that these are parallel lines that are increasing their distance from the viewer. And then we have light and shadow. Since closer objects seem to reflect more light, the dimmer of the two objects in a field of vision will seem farther. So that's a little bit different than what the cast shadows one up here. This just means that if you have two objects and the lighting is different on them, the one that is brighter will appear to be closer than the dimmer of the two objects. Okay, so a little bit about Gestalt psychology. So Gestalt comes from a German word that I think means grouped or together. So it's a set of principles that govern how humans group individual parts of an image to construct an entire large image. So it's basically just how we group images to make sense, how we group they could be sometimes ambiguous images to make sense in our mind. So emergence is the first one we're going to talk about, the first principle. So in attempting to identify an object, we first identify its outline, which then allows us to figure out what the object is. So if you cover the top half of this picture, and that's the first thing you look at, you are not going to notice, you're not going to see 4 legs and the lower half of body of a cheetah. If you look at the entire picture, you're going to notice all at once that there's a cheetah in this picture. And then once you realize that there's a cheetah or some sort of animal in this picture, then you can start to see the smaller structures. You can see the head, you can see the 4 legs, you can see its tail, you can see the texture in its skin, but that is not, those smaller features are not, they're not as apparent to us until we identify the entirety of this animal. So that's what emergence is, and that's just another one of those properties that allow us to make sense out of things that have no outline or aren't 100% stable. So we have multi-stability, and these are ambiguous images that may alternate back and forth between alternative interpretations in our mind. So it's basically seeing 2 things at once. These 2 are more, the more popular images when we talk about multi-stability. So the left one, you could look at either of those squares as being in the foreground or background. And when you look at it, often if you keep looking long enough, they're going to switch back and forth. And the picture to the right, it looks like 2 people looking at each other. If you're looking as the white in the foreground, or if you're looking the black in the foreground, then it looks like some sort of chalice or a really fancy cup. But these are both good examples of multi-stability where you're seeing 2 images, but they're both equally plausible. So your brain pretty much just alternates between interpretations. And the next 5 laws are considered Gestalt laws of grouping. So the law of proximity, objects that are near each other seem to be grouped together. If you look at the bottom right, you see a bunch of lines. You don't really interpret them as individual lines. You interpret them as a bunch of lines that are creating a square because they're in proximity, so we assume them to be grouped together. The law of continuity, we perceive smooth continuous lines and forms even when they are broken up in the image. So we can look right over here, this continuity. These curves in this line, these don't necessarily have to be continuous because they could be broken up by this line right over here, this straight line. So this could just be a series of alternating semicircles, but because of this continuity, the law of continuity, we're going to perceive it as one continuous squiggly line. The law of closure, we perceive things as complete logical entities. So you can see over here to the right, we have this triangle. It's not closed. We can see that it's not an actual closed shape, but we can assume that that is a triangle just because of our perception. We like to perceive things as complete and closed. So we're going to perceive that as a triangle. The law of common fate, objects moving in synchrony are perceived as a group or unit. You can see up here, ducks, for example, any sort of bird, if they're flying in a row, if they're flying in a V, whatever formation, we're gonna group them up and we're gonna consider them a unit because they're moving in the same direction. And the law of connectedness, things that are joined or linked are perceived as connected. Don't overthink that one. It's just exactly what it is. If we look at the bottom right, we don't see 6 dots, we see 3 groups of 2. So the reason why we see 3 groups of 2 rather than 6 dots is because this law of connectedness. We're seeing 3 entities instead of 6 because of those lines that are connecting them. Okay, we'll do another review question. So a patient who has just recently lost vision in his right eye and has most likely been relying on which depth cues for perception? So take a minute or two, again, pause the video, please. I will go over it in a couple of seconds. Okay, let's review. So a patient who has just recently lost vision in his right eye has most likely been relying on which depth cues for perception? So we have Roman numeral 1, which is retinal disparity, 2 is interposition, 3 is relative clarity, and 4 is convergence. So the answer is the answer is B, which is 2 and 3 only. This was just pretty much a basic comprehension question. You just have to know the definitions of the 4 of these. 1, retinal disparity is a binocular cue. So if a patient loses vision in one of their eyes, they are not going to be able to use binocular cues. They'll have to rely completely on monocular cues for visual perception. So retinal disparity is a binocular cue, and 4, Roman numeral 4, which is convergence, is also a binocular cue. So the only ones that they would be able to use are 2 and 3, interposition or occlusion, and relative clarity. So 2 and 3 would be those binocular cues. So the correct answer would be B. Okay, so this is the last part of the lesson. We're going to talk a little bit about attention, and we're going to focus on Donald Broadbent and Treisman and their models of selective attention. So what is attention? Attention is the concentration of one's awareness and perception on a specific stimulus. When studying attention, we usually look at two components separately, selective and divided. So our first focus is on selective attention. Attention must be selected because our minds have a limited capacity to pay attention and must devote it carefully. So we only have a finite amount of attention that we can give that we can devote to a specific task or a specific stimulus at any given second, any given moment. So that's why a lot of times we are not as good at multitasking as we think we are, although we will talk a little bit about divided attention after we talk about the theories of selective attention. So the first theory is Broadbent, Donald Broadbent's theory. And he used a series of dichotic listening setups, which a lot of people studying attention at the time did, to create an attended and unattended channel to which the subjects could focus their attention. So basically what the series of the dichotic listening setup is usually they would just have headphones on one ear and the other, and the subject would be told to focus their attention on a specific ear. So say they were told to focus on the left ear, they would be hearing one thing in the left ear and another message would be playing in the right ear, and their attention would be focused on the right ear, on the left ear. So that would be the ear to which their attention is focused is considered the attended channel, and the ear to which they are not listening to is considered the unattended channel. So multiple inputs may be received into the sensory store in this model, his filter model, but one input is selected to make it through the selective filter. So note, this information is filtered based on basic physical characteristics. According to this theory, this is before the information makes it to the brain for semantic processing. So Broadbent was saying that when we hear things, it's based on strictly physical characteristics. So like the pitch of the sound, how loud it is. It has nothing to do with semantic processing or anything having to do with meaning or higher level processing. That comes later in the process. So Broadbent is saying that we know what we're paying attention to really quickly before we even have to do any higher level processing. So then the filtered information, what makes it through that filter, is processed and stored in the working memory. And we can look right down here. So we have the attended message going into that left ear that we're listening to. We have the unattended message going into the other ear that we are not consciously listening to. That immediately enters the sensory store, and then it goes through this selective filter. So based on physical properties like pitch or loudness, and then that bottleneck is what's actually coming out of the selective filter. So this should be information from the attended channel that makes it through the selective filter to higher level processing, where we can make sense of what the sound actually is, and then we can put it in our working memory to utilize it. According to Broadbent's theory, if unwanted stimuli are consciously filtered out so early, no information in the unattended ear should make it into the working memory. That, however, was not the case. The theory does not explain the cocktail effect, which also explains, which will also go hand in hand with how information in the unattended ear was making it into working memory. So the cocktail effect basically is, if you're in the middle of a conversation at a large, loud cocktail party where there are multiple conversations going on around you, you're going to be focused on the conversation that you're in, and you're focusing most of your attention there because everything else is just so loud and such background noise. You still may be able to recognize somebody calling your name from across the room. So according to Broadbent's theory, that is really, really unlikely, because that would technically be considered an unattended channel. So there's no, the fact that you would hear someone calling your name but would not hear any other random word would suggest or lead us to believe that there is higher level processing going on before we're filtering out these words. Or at the very least, the unattended channel is not being completely eliminated, it's just being weakened. So more simply put, the theory doesn't explain how familiar stimuli in an unattended channel capture our attention. So Treisman decided to create a model to try to explain the cocktail party effect, or how any information from that unattended channel is getting through. So instead of a filter, like Broadbent said, she believed the mind has an attenuator that simply weakens the unattended signal rather than completely eliminating it. So right over here, this attenuating filter, instead of a regular filter, the bottleneck can actually let multiple inputs through. Some might be weaker than others based on where we were focusing our attention. The channel that we're focusing our attention on is going to have a much easier time getting through the attenuator. But in this model, unattended stimuli could make it into working memory. So if it makes it past that attenuating filter, your name, say we're talking about the cocktail party example again, in Broadbent's model, if you're not paying attention for someone to call your name, or no one's calling your name in the current conversation you're in, then that name should not make it to your working memory. However, as it does in reality, and as Anne Treisman's model explains, it's more likely that your mind works as an attenuator and just weakens the signal if you're not paying attention. So it could still make it through that bottleneck. And then once it gets to those higher areas of processing, you're going to recognize it as your name, and you are definitely going to shift it over into your working memory. Okay, so those were the two main theories that you'll find on the MCAT about selective attention. You should definitely know who Donald Broadbent and Anne Treisman are. Their names pop up a lot on the Psych and Soc. So definitely just know what they are and what they studied. And we're going to talk really quickly about divided attention as well. So according to the resource model of attention, we have a finite amount of attention that we can devote at a given moment. Generally, if the resources required to perform multiple tasks simultaneously exceed the available resources, so if the sum of all of it exceeds the available resources, the task cannot be accomplished at the same time, which makes sense. It's going to be a lot easier to do two easy tasks at the same time than it is to do two incredibly difficult tasks at the same time. There are three factors that affect our outcomes when multitasking. Task similarity, such as using the same modality for processing. If we're processing heat information or mechanical information, for example. If you're using that same modality, it may cause interference. So for example, it may be harder to listen to a song and listen to the news simultaneously, because you're trying to listen and you're trying to bring information in pretty much from the same channel. So it might be more difficult to do that simultaneously than to listen to a song and analyze a painting. Because when you're analyzing a painting, you're mostly using your vision, and when you're listening to a song, obviously you're mostly using your hearing, as opposed to the previous where you're using hearing for two different tasks. So task similarity can cause interference. Task difficulty takes up more resources. So a funny example of this is you may stop talking in a conversation when you're driving if you come up to a complicated intersection. I'm definitely guilty of this. And it happens sometimes subconsciously, and you don't really realize why you're doing it. But it actually is because when you're doing something, as minute as it might seem, you're taking attention away from driving and you're devoting attention to doing something else. So the more difficult a task is, the more attention it is going to take away from another task. And remember, we do have a finite amount of attention that we can devote. And task practice, of course, we can devote less attention to better practice activities. So a beginner saxophone player, for example, will devote much more attention to her hand placements than someone who's been playing for decades. And it becomes working memory. They don't have to devote their attention too much to what their hands are actually doing because, again, muscle memory. Cool. So this brings us to our last review question. A test subject is being set up with a dichotic listening task. According to Broadbent's theory, which of the following would the test subject most likely remember from the unattended channel after the task is over? Remember, we're talking about Broadbent's theory, so take a minute, pause, take a minute, and I will go over the answer in a couple of seconds. Okay, which of the following would the test subject most likely remember from the unattended channel after the task is over? The correct answer is nothing. So remember, Broadbent's theory, he has that filter. So Broadbent's theory really says that anything coming from the unattended channel, we're not really paying attention to, and it's not going to make it through that filter. So familiar words would make it through Anne Treisman's attenuator. Low-pitched noises will not make it through because we're not devoting attention to them in the unattended channel. And the same thing, their own name, we're not devoting attention, so it's not going to make it through. But again, in Treisman's attenuator model, our own name is something that's super familiar to us, so we would be much more likely to notice it, even if it is in the unattended channel. But again, since we're talking about Broadbent, the correct answer is D. Nothing is going to pass through that unattended channel. All right, so that is it for today's lecture. That is my email. You can email me at christopherscagnelli1@gmail.com if you have any questions about the lecture, if you want to review anything, if you have any questions about Socratic Med or our course, any of our office hours, tutoring, if you have any questions at all, you want to be added to our group me, just shoot me an email. Other than that, I hope you guys are doing great studying, and I will talk to you guys next week.